Now we're going to turn to Daf Chav Zayin Amud Beis. We've just established that in a case of avuka kenegdo, and only in the case of avuka kenegdo, does Rebbe say that the pas is asura. Michlal de rabbanan pligele afilu bi avuka kenegdo. The rabbanan were the ones who disagreed with Rebbe, and in their dissenting view, they were matir the pas that was heated up by atzei arla. How could that be? If it's a case of avuka kenegdo, and the fire is shooting up from the eitzim directly into the pas, and it's baking this dough, then he's certainly being neneh from the eitzim. So the Gemara answers, Sharu afilu kishavuka kenegdo. It is the heat that comes from the avuka, from this torch, so to speak, of atzei arla, that sets up a baking process that triggers off the baking of the dough. And that heat that is baking the dough comes from the eitzim as they're being consumed, they're being burnt. In other words, it's not the part of the eitzim that's still intact that's generating the heat. According to Chacham, the heat is coming from that part of the eitzim, of the wood, that's actually burning. And at that point, that part of the, let's call it, if you picture it up and down, the top part of the eitzim, that's already gecholim, and it's no longer klipe arla. So Gemara asks the kasha, eitzim bisurid l'rabbanon heichim ishkachasla. Is there a scenario in which even the rabbanon will agree that if you bake your bread with the fuel of atzei asher as the fire comes up, it's asur ba'no, you're not allowed to eat this pas? What would be a scenario, a hechetimtz, in which even the rabbanon would say it's asur? Because we have a Mishnah in Masechta Avodah Zarah that says, not only he takes from the asherah, the wood of this idolatry tree, it's asur ba'no. So it means that there's a stam Mishnah. Apparently, all the Chachamim agreed unanimously that there would be an Isur Hana if you burn Atzei Asherah and you use it for your benefit to cook something. The answer is name, says the Gemara. Omar Rav Ami bar Chama b'shar shifa, to bake or cook with the fire of Isur Hana, Atzei Asherah would be mutter according to the Chachamim. The only case in which Atzei Asherah would be asur is if you have a benefit from the eitzim in their original state, where they're intact and they're not burning, and that's called sharshifa. Sharshifa means that he took this wood, he took it to a carpenter, and this is wood from an asherah tree, Avodah Zarah. The carpenter made a seat for him, and he sits on the seat, or the carpenter made a little stool for him, and he puts his feet up on top of the stool. He's now benefiting directly from atzei asherah and their be'en. They haven't been burned. They haven't mamashas. And therefore, he is violating that Isur Hana in those cases. So the pas itself is muteres because the Hana is coming after biur, meaning after the wood has burnt. But if he has direct benefit from the Atzei Asherah, that's when he violates the Isur of Avodah Zarah. Rebbe Rami bar Chama mirav Chizda. Tanur sheisiku bi atzei hegdesh. He takes eitzim of hegdesh and ofabos hapas, he heats up the oven, and now he bakes his bread. L'rabbanan desharu bekamaisa, according to the Chachamim, who said that in the case of klipe arla, ein shvach eitzim bepas, and therefore he's allowed to eat the pas that was baked in an oven that was heated by atzei asherah. What's the din if we substitute for klipe arla, eitzei hegdesh? Amalei pas asura. In this case, even the Chacham agree that you're not allowed to benefit from the pas. So Gemara immediately asks, ma bein zu, meaning this bread that was baked with atzei hegdesh, le arla, to the pas that was baked from atzei arla, klipe arla. Amar Rava chi hashta, arla b'tela b'masai. Hegdesh afil bi'elef lo but. We have a chumrah in hegdesh that doesn't apply to not to arla, not to klai kerem, and that is there's no bittul in hegdesh. So it means Two things. Number one, it means that Hegdish is more chomer than all other Isurim, and therefore we might ask the pas, even though the Atzei Hegdish were already burning. And secondly, this whole process of Ein Shvach Eitzim and Pas is predicated to some extent on the concept of bittul. We don't view the Atzei Ashera or the Atzei Orla as an actual Hana in the Pas. It's batel, it loses its status, but Hegdish can never lose its status. Rava objects to Rav Chisda's formulation. Elama Rava, ikashale ha kasha. I have a question and objection to raise against Rav Chisda. We have a principle, by way of introduction, of Me'ila behegdish. And Me'ila behegdish has two sides of a coin. Number one, if you benefit from hegdish, the hegdish is yotza l'chulin. It's a process of being mechalel the hegdish. You desecrate the kedusha of hegdish. And number two, you have the chiyuvim of Me'ila. And you're going to have to bring a korban Me'ila, and you have to pay the fees, Karen v'chomish, whatever the laws of Me'ila are. So Rav objects here. Wait a second. He uses the hegdish, the atei hegdish, as a fuel. That is Me'ila. He is benefiting from hegdish. We have a principle that anything that has what's called kedushas damim, it's not kedushas haguf. And kedushas haguf, even if you moel, let's say mizbeach, you moel in bemis kodshim, it's not yotze lechulim, but in kedushas damim, like the case of atzei hegdesh, then it's yotze lechulim. So the moment that he bakes his bread, how could you, Rav Chisda, claim the bread is prohibited because he's benefiting from hegdesh? It's no longer hegdesh. Because once he burns the fire, lights the fire of the oven, it's already me'ila, and it's already yotzei l'chulin. Amar Papa, hacha bi'atzei shlamim askinan. This is not your regular case of kedushas damim with an iser me'ila. This is a case of a quasi kedushas haguf. How do you have eitzim that are kiddush saguf and don't lend themselves to Me'ila? It's a case of atzei shlamim. Atzei shlamim means that he was magdish eitzim for the purpose of buying shlamim, meaning he'd sell the eitzim on the market, and then he would take the money and buy shlamim. Therefore, the eitzim, in that case where he's magdish them in order to sell them for shlamim, gain the status of kedushas haguf. They have a status similar to that of korban shlamim, and we're going to assume that therefore they're not yotzei l'chulin because there's no din me'ila. Now at this point we have to mention that there's no din me'ila in shlamim, and therefore if the kedusha of these atzei shlamim is that of shlamim, then there's no me'ila, and hence we've answered Rava's objection. The Gemara says, I'll leave it to Rebby Yehuda. The Omar hegdish b'shogeg mischalel. The mezid ain't a mischalel. If a person misappropriates hegdish, but he does so b'shogeg, then that me'ila is motzi es hegdish l'chulin. But if he does it deliberately, eino mischal. Now we're not sure whether or not that is a doraisa halacha or a drabanan halacha, and the origin of Rebby Yehuda's shita is in a Sugya in Masechta Kedushin and Hay, and it's a bit of a complicated Sugya, different girsos. So the Gemara now tries to explain why is it that according to Rebby Yehuda, b'mezid ein mischal, b'mezid my taima lo, why isn't it mischal, why isn't it yotzei l'chulin, came under lav bar me'ilahu. If a person violates me'ila deliberately, then A, he's not chayav a korban asham, which is only brought for shogeg. Number two, he's not chayav the extra chomesh. And number 3, lo nafik l'chulin. The parsha of Me'ilah does not operate in any shape or form, even with regard to the dimension of Hamoel is mischaleh. Therefore, the Gemara says by analogy, Shlomim Nami, even in the case of a Hegdish of Shlomim, Kevin the Lav Har Me'ilah Ninhu, there's no Chiv Me'ilah on Shlomim, is Lo Nafki L'chulin. That halacha that through Me'ilah, the Hegdish is Yotza L'chulin, it's Mischal, doesn't apply to Shlomim. And therefore, we understand very well if he bakes the pas with Atzei Hegdish, and these eitzim were sanctified for the purpose of Shlomim, the pas itself is Asura, and the reason for that is the eitzim are not Yotzi L'chulin, and they remain Hegdish, they have the status of Shlomim, and they're Asamana, and this Isur generates an Isur in the pas, even according to the Chacham. The Gemara now raises an objection to the objection of Rava. Rava had said that anyone who does Me'ilah, and by lighting the eights of the fire, it's Yotzi L'chulin, says the Gemara, V'chol heichen demal amasik nafki l'chulin. Is that really true? That whenever the moel, the person who misappropriated hegdish, he uses the atzei hegdish in order to heat up his oven, the eitzim are Yotzi L'chulin. V'atanya, we have a brayso that says kol hanisrafim, all Isurei Hanah that have a mitzvah of sreifa. For example, let's take the case of Nosar, or better yet, let's take a case of Arla, Klaya Kerem, Truma Tmeah, Chometz Pesach. In all these cases, once you burn them, you burn the Klipe Arla, and then the Afer, the ashes that result from the burning are mutter. It means that once you fulfilled the mitzvah to burn it, then that's mafkir the Isur Hanah. That's called Naseis Mitzvahs. Chutz mi'atzei Asherah. The exception to the rule is Atzei Asherah, that even though the mitzvah is sreifa and you have to burn them, the Efer is still awesome. And another exception to this rule is the Efer Hegdesh Liolam also. If he takes Atzei Hegdesh and he burns them, then the ashes that result are always us. Now, this contradicts Rava, because Rava says that when you take Hegdish and you use it and you burn it, then it's Yotze L'chulin. Here we're talking about a case where he is benefiting from Hegdish even after the Sreifa. Whereas according to Rava, with the Sreifa, he is Moel. Amar Rabbi Bar Chama, what's the case in the Brisa? Kigon shenafla dleika me'aleha bi'atzei Asherah. This was not a case of Me'ilah. Me'ilah means he deliberately and actively misappropriated Hegdish. But here, a fire broke out and burnt the Atzei Hegdish, and now we have ashes. The Leka Inish, the Nimel, there's no Me'ilah. Nobody violated Nisa Me'ilah. And in that case, we understand why the Efer is also Liola, because if there's no Me'ilah, it's not Yotzi L'chulin. Gemara offers a second possible answer. Rabbi Shmaya Omar, he says that when it says Efer Hegdish is also, that's the Oson Shetu'unim Gniza. That's only with regard to Hegdish that requires Gniza, and that means the Efer of the Trumas Hadeshen, and that requires Gniza, which means you're not allowed to benefit from the Efer. Now, again, we're talking about a case of Trumas Hadeshen where you were allowed to burn the Kodshim, and nevertheless, the Efer requires Gniza. The Gemara is going to learn this halach in Trumas Hadeshen from a special Yalfutza, a pasuk in Vayikra Vav. V'samo eitzam is beach. V'samo, it doesn't say v'shlich. It means v'samo, he's got to put it down in a very specific place, next to the mizbeach. He's got to do it b'nachas, and there's a halach of sima, of resting it down, not hashlocha, not to throw it. And it says v'samo, it could have said v'sam. What's v'samo? Kulo. Kulo means the entire shear of the truma. It's not enough miktsasa. And then v'samo shalo yefazer. That the word v'sam means you got to place it down. He's not allowed to let it, spread and throw the ashes in this direction and that direction. All of the ashes, the entire volume, have to be placed in one location. So we see here that Trumas Hadeshen needs Geniza next to the Mizbeach, and that generates an Isser Anah. So it has nothing to do with whether it's Me'ilah or not Me'ilah. But anything that needs Geniza is Asur Ba'anah. And therefore, Efer Hegdish Li Olam, Asur, because we derive from the Pasuk V'samo that it needs Geniza. Now, at this point, we are going back to Masechta Pesachim, so to speak, meaning to Chometz, and the Mishnah had recorded back on Daf Chaf Aleph of Machlokas between Rebby Yehuda and the Chacham as to how to fulfill the mitzvah of Ach B'Yom HaRishon Tashbisu. Rebby Yehuda's opinion was Ein Bir Chometz Ela Sreifa, and the Chachamim say Mefazer V'Zoreh L'Ruach. You can take the Chometz, crumble it, and throw it to the wind. And now we're going to quote a brisa that's going to explain why Rebby Yehuda insists on Sreifa. Tanya Omar Rebby Yehuda Ein Bir Chometz Ela Sreifa. And we're going to derive this now from a Kavachomer from Nosar. By Din Nosain, we have a Kavachomer, Man Nosar. If you have Karbanos, the meat of which was left beyond the time allotment, and it became Nosar, She'eno bi bal yirah u bal yimot. So the Torah wasn't so machmir in the case of Nosar to impose these extra two isurim, which it did in the case of Chometz called bal yirah bal yimot. And yet, nevertheless, ta'un sreifa. The Torah says that a Nosar ba'esh tisrofu. Is Chometz sheyeshno b'bal yirah bal yimot? The Torah is even more machmir in Chometz than it was in Nosar. The Torah says that as long as you leave it in your rishus after the Zman Yitzur, you violate a lav, a tulam. It's lo kolshken, how much more so should tone sreifa that we should require sreifa. Now, if that be the case, then imagine the case, according to Rebby Yehuda, of a person who wants to get rid of his chametz, and he has no opportunity to burn them in a campfire. He just doesn't have any logs, or it's very dangerous, or whatever it might be. So Amrullah, the Chacham say, Kol din shatadon mitchilas lahachmir, v'sofa lahakil eno din. You are exceeding the bounds and the power of kal v'chomer. Kal v'chomer means that we're going to derive a chumrah from a kal and apply it certainly to the chomer. But if that chumrah is also asi lidei kula, it's sofa lahakil, then you cannot derive from a kavachomer a chumrah that's sofa lahakil. And here in this case, it's sofa lahakil. Why? Because you're telling me you're restricting him. The only way he can fulfill the mitzvah of bir chametz is with sreifa. He's going to run around and look for the opportunity for sreifa, but lo matzah eitzim with sarfa. Lo and behold, he cannot find logs. Is Yehei Yoshevu Batel? He's not going to destroy his chametz according to Rebby Yehuda because he doesn't have access to a fire. Just get rid of it. Don't start running around trying to create a fire, and if you don't find a fire, then you're not going to be Makayim, you're going to be Yochek Batel Liyah Chametz in your rishus. And now, Rebby Yehuda is in a defensive position. The Chachamim have now rejected his Kal V'chomer. Chaza Rebby Yehuda v'dano midin acher. Now, what this means is, din acher is called a binyan av. And the difference between a Kal V'chomer and a binyan av is that whereas a Kal V'chomer could only work if it's a chumrah below asi lidei kula, it's not sofa lahakil. In the case of a binyan av works absolutely straight across the board, no strings attached. And it doesn't matter whether it's a chumrah or a kula, it's just a binyan av, it's an equation. The Torah told us to equate two dinim, and we're going to equate those two dinim. And what is this binyan av of Rebby Yehuda? Nosar is asur b'achila. V'chometz asur b'achila is therefore, we're going to say that ma nosar b'sreifa, af chometz b'sreifa. We have a binyan av that anything that's prohibited in achila has to be burnt. And where do I see that from? I derive that from nosar. So since nosar, by virtue of the fact that it's asur b'achila, you have to burn it, so too chometz, which is asur b'achila, you have to burn it. So the Gemara says, if that be the case, it's not true that anything that's asur b'achila needs sreifa, although in the case of nosar it does require sreifa. But what about the case of nevela? The Torah never required that you burn nevela. You're not allowed to eat nevela. Amalahem, so Rebby Yehuda responds to the Chachamim, Hefresh, I have a major difference between nosar asur b'achila ubehana. When I isolate nosar, and I want to use it as a binyan av to teach me that isuri achila requires sreifa, that's because nosar is not just asur b'achila, but it's also asur behana. Is ma nosar ton sreifa, af chometz ton sreifa. Chometz also happens to be asur b'hana, but the vela is not asur b'hana. Like gerashem b'shrechi titanena. Now wait a second. It comes out that according to Rebby Yehuda, the second formulation, any Isser Hana requires Sreifa. And we derive that from Nosar, and we apply it to Chometz. But wait a second. Amru Lo, what about Shar Niskal? Shar Niskal is also Hana, and there is no requirement to Sreifa. Yochiach, therefore, Shar Niskal should be a proof to undermine your Shita. Shu Aser B'Achilu B'Hana V'Eino Ton Sreifa. Now, how are you going to derive Chometz with this binyan av from nosar, and then say, well, we're only going to apply this binyan av to the case of Chometz. Chometz is asur b'hana, and therefore it's ton sreifa. But other Yisrei Hana, for example, Shar Niskal, they don't require sreifa. They're not included in this binyan av. I mean, that seems so arbitrary. Amalahem, so Rebby Yehuda responds to the Chachamim, Hefresh. There's a difference between nosar and chometz on the one hand and shar niskal on the other hand. Nosar asur b'achilu b'hana, and not only that, but v'onush kares. Chometz is asur b'achilu b'hana v'onush kares. So we have a striking resemblance to set up a binyan between nosar and chometz. A, B, and C. A an isur achila, B an isur hana, and C a chiyuv kares. However, when we get to Shar Niskal, that's not Chayiv Karetz. Is therefore, since the Torah equated Nosar and Chometz with all these three elements, Achila, Hana, and Karetz, is Ma B'Sreifa, Nosar is B'Sreifa, Af Chometz B'Sreifa. So that unless you find another Macholas Asuros, which is an Isur Achila, Hana, and Kares, then there's not going to be any derivation of Sreifa. Amrulo, Chacham say, I'm going to come up with a case where all three are checked off, all three boxes. It's Asur Achila, Asur Hana, and Chayiv Kares, and yet there's no mitzvah of Sreifa. Chelbo shel Shar Niskal Yochiach. After they do skila on the Shar Niskal, then they took out the chaylev. Now the chaylev of Shar Niskal, unlike other chaylev, is asur b'hana because it's part of Shar. The Shar is asur b'hana. And if you eat chaylev, you incur a chiyuv kares. And chaylev, because it's from a Shar Niskal, is asur b'hana. So now we have a chaylev that's number one, asur b'achila, number two, it's asur b'hana, and number three, it generates a chiyuv kares. And yet, the ein ton sreifa. We never found anywhere that the chaylev of a Shar Niskal requires sreifa. And here we turn to Daf Chav Ches. Chazer Rebby Yehuda v'dano din acher nosar yeshna v'maltosiru chometz v'maltosiru ma nosar b'sreifa af chometz b'sreifa. Now we're going to add a fourth box, a fourth striking similarity between Chometz and Nosar, and that is that both have a kind of Bal Yirah by Matzah, meaning the Torah in both cases says you're not allowed to keep it in your Rishus. You got to get rid of it, and that's called Hanosar or Eish Tisrofu. Burn it, get rid of it. Don't keep it around. You're not allowed to lie it around. Let it lie around. And Chometz has the same halacha of Bal Tosiru, meaning that you're not allowed to leave it around. You're enjoined from leaving it in your possession because of Bal Yirah by Matzah. And just like Nosar requires Sreifa, therefore, says Rebby Yehuda, Chometz requires Sreifa. Okay, then this is where we're going to stop. So we're on the top of Chav Ches Amud Aleph. We're up to Amru Lo. Excuse me. Okay, then. So